I would love to hear from Mark. Why did he start himself the Muslim Brotherhood and this vicious hatred of Jews?
I think it started with Hajj Amin al-Husseini viewed Jews as agents of westernization. If you look at his ideology, he hated the West just as much as he hated the Jews. And part of that is because he looked at the Muslim world falling behind the West, and they blamed Western influence for that. The reason for their failings, in his mind, was that Muslims weren't acting Muslim enough. They need to become more extreme and more rigid. And so, the Jews are viewed as a subset of the Western culture that has made their youth fall into sin, and fall into poverty, and fall into failure overall. I mean, the West is basically a scapegoat, but that's still a problem that we're dealing with today. That I've read press accounts from places like Saudi Arabia and Sudan where if there's starvation or problems with alcoholism, they don't talk about the problem of kids getting beer, it's the problem of Western influence. It's always about this foreign influence that corrupts minds, and I think that's the crux of the matter. And that's why in that 1991 U.S. Muslim Brotherhood document, they said that their mission is eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within. And the other thing I forgot to mention was that they said they want to do it with the hands, not just of the believers, the Muslim Brotherhood supporters, but the hands of the non-believers, your hands. Which I thought was an incredibly powerful statement to see in one of their own documents.
Another question?
Yeah, I have a question. Would you care to comment about to what extent their philosophy is actually rooted in the Islam religion? Because we hear told this story that Islam is a peace-loving religion and this and that, but in the same token, I mean, it seems that there's a connection somewhere between those two. So, what's the answer?
Sure. Well, the connection is that it's a strongly rooted interpretation of Islam that they're practicing. I'm not going to say it's the right interpretation because there's so many Muslims that take another interpretation and will argue back and forth with the extremists over verses and context and things like that. And so I'm not going to say which version is right, which one is wrong, but I will say that Muslim Brotherhood and the rest of them, they cite verses in the Quran as they guide themselves and as they teach this ideology. The other side, the other Muslims will say they're taken out of context or they're citing verses that aren't credible. Just like with any religion, you have these big debates about how to come to grips with modernity and these other political issues. But we have to recognize that both sides are drawing upon Islamic texts in order to make their case.
Yes, sir.
It seems that one visible ones are the ones that embrace the more violent version,
right?
And not the one that peace-loving and that kind of stuff. We
right.
see it in this country.
Right. And
you never hear about any peace-loving folks standing up over there and saying something, and it's a free country.
Well, there's plenty that are standing up. You just have to be willing to listen and seek them out because they don't have the microphone that the other groups have. So you'll have groups like the Council on American and Islamic Relations that'll condemn 9/11, but then you ask them to condemn Hamas, and they get all nervous and don't answer the question. But there is a growing number of Muslim American organizations that are relatively new because they had to form as a response to the Brotherhood. So whenever you're forming as a response, you just don't have so much time and resources. But they are growing in power. For example, at radicalislam.org, one of the series that I do is called Muslims Against Islamists, where I interview activists that are Muslims fighting against radical Islam, and so that they can tell their stories and actually have an audience. And that accomplishes two things. Number one, it helps hurt the extremists because it's undercutting their base. And then secondly, it's also showing that most Muslims don't believe this, and showing that there is this other face. But you are touching on a very important problem, which is that the Muslim Brotherhood and the other extremist forces are the most well-organized and well-financed, so they are going to be the ones that you see unless you're like me and do this 9 to 5.
Just I'm not saying what but I have one point to make about that. And that is, what is the American government, the free world, supporting those who speak the right way,
We don't.
which is what happened in Europe during the communism.
Right, and this is a bipartisan problem where we haven't put much effort into identifying those Muslim activists that genuinely preach a more secular, liberal, democratic version of their faith, and we need to. And part of the reason that we don't is because, well, you have some parts of the government that still believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is moderate somehow. So you have to contend with that. And then you also have to contend with the other part that feels that any type of meddling like that inevitably backfires. And so when I talk to some officials, what they'll say is, well, we don't want to endorse certain moderate Muslim organizations because then they'll be viewed as American or Israeli proxies and they won't have credibility. But I talk to these organizations. They want us to back them. For example, the former president of Indonesia is this man named President Wahid, who wrote a book making the case against the Muslim Brotherhood in Indonesia that had a huge impact on the elections there. It actually caused the Muslim Brotherhood to lose the elections. And he had all this momentum going, but then he said, this is going to fail if we don't find a way to get the funding to build a civil society movement. Because that's what the other side has, but we don't. And most of his operations were funded by donors from outside the country. And it failed, because he didn't have that outside support. Most people don't even know who he is.
Yes, sir.
Now, wasn't Husseini made the Mufti of Jerusalem by a British commander at
Yes.
that time after World War I?
Yep. He was installed against the wishes of the population living there by the British as the Grand Mufti, which is one of those weird stories in history that I'm still trying to figure out. But basically, they held leadership elections, and Hajj al-Husseini came in 4th place. And the British stepped in and said, no, 1st place. And they put him in power, and I think it's because they wanted to co-opt him and bring him over to their side, make him dependent upon their authority, and then they could control him, and it didn't work.
Yeah, they thought he would, because they did that, he would transform to be, different.
Exactly. Right.
John, go ahead.
So what are the mechanisms they plan to use to infiltrate and destroy us?
Well, they tell us in their own documents, which is something I've got a project going on right now where I'm going through all their internal documents and trying to explain how they do it. But basically, it's like political activism. No one has any problem talking about how oil companies or drug companies engage in lobbying or political influence operations, but then the second you say that the Muslim Brotherhood is doing it, people say, oh, you're crazy, that's McCarthyism or whatever. But they're just doing the same thing that they've seen other companies and other foreign governments do, which is where you try and push your point of view to influence another government. It's not something abnormal for foreign governments and foreign movements to do. For example, we recently arrested a Pakistani intelligence guy because he set up a front just like one of these Muslim Brotherhood fronts in the United States to meet with politicians and try and push their point of view. So it's really the same type of any other lobbyist. What they try and do is they deal with churches a lot, they deal with politicians a lot, they present themselves as the vote getters for politicians, and one of the things that's most frightening to me is that whenever you criticize one of these groups, they have a ready-made coalition to defend them. So let me give you an example. If a politician, for example, criticizes one of these Muslim Brotherhood front organizations, all the other front organizations will issue a news release on the same day. And all the churches that they work with and the other interfaith partners that they have will also release the same news release. And they all go after the same person. But what I'm finding is, as I research these organizations, is that they are much smaller than they appear. The one guy that's working in this organization also works in this one. But because there's so many of the fronts operating in unison, it gives this impression that there's this tidal wave of hysteria against their opponent, but in reality, it's just the same group under different names.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Where do they get their money from? Which country supports them?
Well, they're getting a lot of money from Saudi Arabia. Some of them claim that they don't get foreign funding anymore, whether you believe them or not. I mean, I probably don't. But they also get a lot of funding from the United States. They can get it through all sorts of creative means, just by donors in the United States that don't realize what they're donating to. They can get donors overseas. And here's an example. Best Buy actually gave a few $1,000s to a fundraiser by the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I was part of a movement to boycott them in response to that, because not only did they give money to the fundraiser, after we notified them about it, they didn't say, sorry, we won't do it again. They said, oh, well, we believe in tolerance. We're showing how tolerant we are. And at that fundraiser was a guy connected to Hamas. And, you know, so there's all these different ways that they can get the money, but that shows just what you're up against. It's the fact that you can have a company be informed of who they're dealing with, and just in the name of showing the tolerance and diversity, they're willing to ignore the evidence and the facts.
Yes, sir.
Does the Muslim Brotherhood support the Shiite ideology or the Sunni?
Sunni. They're Sunni, but it's the Shiite component. There's a Shiite counterpart to the Muslim Brotherhood, you could say, which would be like the Iranian regime. They still hate each other and still fight each other. Like in Syria right now, you have the Iranian regime fighting with the Muslim Brotherhood. But then they'll cooperate when it comes to working with Hamas against Israel, or whenever it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they're willing to work together. But from a Western perspective, the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood and the radical Shiite elements that we're worried about, the ideologies are very similar, but when you're a radical, you're going to focus on that little difference, and that's why they end up killing each other.
Neil?
Seems to be 3 points I'd like to bring up. What do you think the impact was of Obama going to Cairo and saying that the West was basically guilty for mistreating the Arab world and we've acted arrogantly, and that basically seemed to set off the spring of the Arab Spring, much like Jimmy Carter telling Shah of Iran not to go after the followers of Khomeini, and all of a sudden they were let out of the jails and they popped out of the woodwork and they took over the country. The second part is, how do you see the civil war going on in Syria now? Aaron Klein on WABC has been talking about the fact that it's Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood that we are financing to take over Syria, and we're literally splitting our own throats because the Assad regime isn't very good, but these guys are even worse. And the third point is, when the Iranians finally do get the atomic bomb, and I don't think the question of if, it's just a matter of when, what do you think that this will do to the movement for the establishment of a worldwide caliphate? Because they'll finally be able to say that now they're in a position that they can protect all the Muslims against the infidels with their atomic weaponry, and deterrence will not deter them because of the fact that they believe that when they die they will get 72 virgins, so they should all incinerate themselves if they can take us out with them. Right. Please comment on my 3 points.
Sure. As for the first point, nothing we did set off the Arab Spring. That was out of our control. The factors leading to that were at play a long time before that, so I don't think that the mistake we made, I think, was not allying with secular democratic elements in those countries long before, and that's a criticism that you can apply to both political parties and both administrations equally. So I wouldn't say that anything we did set off the Arab Spring. The second question about the civil war in Syria, I've had connections with the Syrian opposition since about 2007, so it's something I've studied with a lot of intensity, and there are genuine good pro-Western elements within Syria. In fact, the ones that started the civil war were secular in nature. They defected from the military, and they were people that don't agree with the Brotherhood agenda. But the problem we face is that the Brotherhood, again, is the most well-organized ones, and all the countries, particularly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, back the Brotherhood. So when that gap happened, when the civil war broke out, you had the Muslim Brotherhood filling in the gap and pushing the more secular elements to the side. So now we're stuck in this very hellish situation where you have the Assad dictatorship backed by Russia and Hezbollah and Iran fighting against what's now essentially an Al-Qaeda-led fighting force, also backed by the Muslim Brotherhood, and all the good guys that were genuinely fighting for democracy and freedom in Syria have now been pushed to the side. And what's sad about that is that they warned us that would happen. When the Syrian officers defected and they went over to Turkey and they started setting up operations to overthrow Assad, They said to us, if you don't work with us, then we're going to lose control on the ground, because there's other groups that have networks on the ground in order to take the fight to Assad. And that's exactly what happened. So that's very unfortunate. And then the third point, what was your third point?
Third point about the Iranian atomic bomb being the shield of the Caliphate.
Right. There was a video produced by Ahmadinejad's office called "The Coming Is Upon Us" that was released a year ago or 2 years ago against the wishes of the regime, because they were producing it and a defector released it to the internet, and it caused a little bit of a political crisis within the Iranian regime, and you can tell why based on its content. In this documentary, which they were planning on shipping through mosques throughout the Middle East, you have these speakers acting as representatives of the Iranian regime, explaining how they're fulfilling specific verses in the Quran, specific prophecies, in order to bring back out of this end times conflict that results in their Messiah appearing and vanquishing the infidel. Really crazy stuff, but when you look at how they're explaining it and the signs that they're seeing that makes them believe it, you can kind of see where they would get that type of logic. And in that, they said that the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, even though it's Sunni, is a fulfillment of prophecy. So it seems like the Iranian regime is okay with allying with the Muslim Brotherhood as it takes power in these other countries. And the main disagreement right now is Syria, because Iran essentially controls the Syrian government. They don't want to give that up. But once that fight's over, Iran will definitely ally with the Muslim Brotherhood in a regional alliance. It's actually already happening. They're already mending the fences and getting closer. As for the nuclear weapon, whether they use a nuclear weapon or not, just even having the capacity to quickly produce a nuclear weapon is something that's very frightening for the region, because then you'll have other countries trying to get the same capacity, other countries bending to the Iranian will just because they have to. And so regardless of whether Iran uses the nuclear weapon or not in terms of detonating it, they can just use it by saying that they have the capacity. And that's very dangerous, but I'm not convinced that the regime is going to get a nuclear weapon, because the Iranian population is so against the regime. It's actually, in my estimation, the most pro-American population in the Middle East outside of Israel is in Iran. And the Iranian nuclear program keeps getting delayed because of these accidental explosions that happen at their nuclear sites, which is very obviously sabotage. So if you just keep delaying it, the regime is one day definitely going to collapse. So the current strategy of just trying to delay that day actually is a workable one.
Yes, sir, up there in front.
I thought that surveys that I've seen have said that the majority of the Iranian people, even though they oppose the current regime, would like to see the country become a nuclear power.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true, but the problem isn't nuclear weapons. It's the government controlling the nuclear weapons. And so as a matter of national pride, you could do a survey in most countries and they would say, yeah, I'd like our country to have nuclear weapons because that makes us stronger. But the issue here is the type of people that is controlling the red button, and whether they'll push it and what they intend to do with that power and the intimidation factor that comes with having that weapon.
Yes, sir.
As far as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt goes, what would be the consequences of them and the peace treaties that they have with Israel? Would they keep honoring that, or are they going to eventually start another war because of the Brotherhood?
The Muslim Brotherhood talks about forming the United Arab States, which is a resurrected caliphate with Jerusalem as the capital. Israel's destroyed. The destruction of Israel is so important to their ideology. It's such a piece of their ideology that cannot be negotiated with, that they're never going to give that up. Now the question is, when would they scrap the peace treaty? Right now they're getting a lot of money from us, and they're focused on their own internal situation. Again, they're not like Al-Qaeda. They actually think things through. So they're going to focus on spreading revolutions in places like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere, and building a regional coalition before they take on Israel. But they've already set up the pretext to scrap that treaty, because they're now claiming that part of that peace treaty is that it's only valid if there's a Palestinian state. Well, there's no Palestinian state, so what that implies is that the peace treaty is no longer valid. So they've already set the stage to scrap it officially. They've come up with the justification, but they're not willing to pull the trigger yet because they have other things to contend with. Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood, can they control the Egyptian army? Or is the Egyptian army strong enough to oppose them?
They do control the military now. When the Muslim Brotherhood took over the civilian government in Egypt, one of the last hopes that we had was that the military could form a block on their power, because they were largely independent, controlled by secularists, and so a lot of us invested our hopes in that. But then one day, the president of Egypt marched in, and next thing we know, the chiefs of the military resigned. He got rid of them, and he replaced them with Brotherhood loyalists. Now, your average Egyptian soldier is probably going to be inclined to be more secularist, so if he were to deploy the military to start killing his own people like Assad is, I'm not convinced that they would obey. But by and large, as an institution, the Brotherhood does control them now.
The second half of that would be, then I gather you would have been against sending to Egypt the F-16 jets and the Abrams tanks?
Yeah, I see no reason to send F-16s to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has as one of their extensions Hamas, which is sworn to the destruction of Israel, and the supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, like their supreme leader, shortly before the Arab Spring, essentially declared jihad on the United States and Israel. No one paid attention. So yes, I think sending weapons to an organization like that's a very bad idea.
Yes, sir.
I didn't really get what your opinion is on what this government has done to foment this movement and how they have indirectly pushed for the installation of this Morsi. This Morsi has anti-Semitic statements in his history. We've already seen it. But it's just very bothersome to me. Mubarak was very moderate. He may have been evil to his people, but in the interests of Israel, he was actually sort of an ally. And I'm trying to get a handle, maybe you can help me, on what this government has done. You just mentioned about the F-16s and the Abrams tanks. We know that the president has actively pushed for Morsi to become in power. And I just don't get it. It just seems like this government in particular seems to have a hankering for these kinds of radicals. And it just bothers me. It bothers me a lot.
I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what the Muslim Brotherhood is about and a desire to make what's called the war on terror a more narrow conflict. One of the things I noticed is that, particularly with the current administration, they are trying to make it all about Al-Qaeda. And they do a good job of fighting Al-Qaeda. But that is only one piece of the pie. And so that's why you had Vice President Biden say that comment that the Taliban isn't our enemy per se. Because the reason he's saying that is because he's trying to say the focus is solely on Al-Qaeda, and they view these other organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Taliban, as bad guys, but guys you can potentially come to a deal with. And there was also just a lot of misinformation about the Muslim Brotherhood, really bizarre statements. For example, the Director of National Intelligence, who I cannot believe is still in power and hasn't been fired, he was testifying before Congress about the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is the top intelligence officer, by the way, said that the Muslim Brotherhood is democratic, secular, and has a lot of diversity. There's nothing secular about even the name Muslim Brotherhood. And, you know, I could go up and down. There's a whole bunch of statements by officials in the current administration and the one previous to it that show that they were misjudging the Muslim Brotherhood and their fronts here in the United States. It's very much a bipartisan problem, but because the Arab Spring happened under this administration's watch, it's becoming more clear right now because everyone's paying attention to the issue. But the same thing was happening under the previous one as well.
Yes, sir.
We have heard you. What did you think you would like to have come out of us having heard you?
Well, if you sign up for our newsletter, which hopefully, did that get around to everybody? Yes.
With you, Neil? Oh, okay.
That's one way you can get more involved in this. And we try and get people involved in things besides like letter writing, because politicians aren't going to read your letters, I'm sorry to say. You know, we try to focus on things that work. So for example, there's a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir that's extremely radical, that supports killing American soldiers, really crazy stuff, that was holding a conference in the Chicago area. And so we have a newsletter list of over 120,000 people, so when we mobilize, it makes an impact. and we had everyone bombard the hotel with phone calls and emails, and we got the event canceled. So there's things like that that we can get everyone involved in. We also have documentaries at radicalism.org that you can show at your church, synagogue, school, whatever, any public venue that you can think of. So you can get involved in doing screenings, which is a very powerful device. So I guess I would say the first point to start with would be signing up for our newsletter, paying attention to what we're doing, and then looking for opportunities, because I can't know where all the opportunities are. Most of these events that I put on is a result of someone attending a previous one and coming up with an idea to show one of our movies here, or having me speak there, or coming up with ideas. So this is very much, I come here to speak not just to educate you, but also to look for a partnership with people that are concerned about this issue.
What was the we you're talking about?
Oh, you mean with radicalism.org?
No, when you say we get involved,
oh,
we're looking for the newsletter.
Oh, that would be me and my bosses and everyone that reads the newsletter. So like I said, we have 120,000 people on there, so when we move and we go after something, we are able to bring attention to it.
Go ahead, sir.
If you're that visible, why are you still here?
Well, there's actually a good answer for that. Because most of the organizations I focus on, like I'll do some reporting and pass information along to where it needs to go when it's related to Al-Qaeda type individuals, but a lot of the people that I'm going after claim to be non-violent, moderate, good guys. So if they kill me, then the whole thing gets lost. So then they make my argument for me. But I was telling Dr. George before, over the summer, in one of the funnier things I've had happen, the Muslim Brotherhood has an English Twitter page, and I woke up one day to them sending a tweet at my name saying, @Ryan Mauro is a fearmonger, and they sent like 3 or 4 tweets just attacking me by name. So they're starting to pay attention.
Neil? Are there any politicians in either political party who realize what's going on and are trying to stop it? It seems that we just confirmed Chuck Hagel, this guy Brennan, who reportedly is a secret Muslim and was converted in Saudi Arabia, coming up next. It seems that the tide is always going in their direction. We hear constantly the talk about that we've got to deal with CARE and all the rest of these groups, that we can't criticize them on cartoons, we can't say anything negative. You can blast Jews, you can blast Christians, you can blast Mormons, you can blast English. Don't say a thing about Muslims because they'll kill you. So, does any of our government understand this, and if not, why not?
I'm trying to figure out why not. Many people do, because the FBI, the group you mentioned, CARE, is like, they're the most bombastic of the Muslim Brotherhood entities. It's the Council on American Islamic Relations. If you've ever seen an organization go out there and call someone an anti-Muslim bigot for virtually no reason, it's them. The FBI cut off ties with them in 2009, once more information came out about their links to Hamas and the Brotherhood. So there are a lot of people that get it within the FBI, Department of Homeland Security. There are members of Congress that get it, but don't really make this a big issue. I'm trying to think of the ones that are the strongest. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senator from New York, he's done some very good stuff on this issue. On the Republican side, it may not be the best messenger, but Representative Bachmann has done good stuff on this. If you remember, she got into some trouble because she and 4 other members of Congress wrote letters about these Muslim Brotherhood front organizations and their relationships with different departments and agencies of the government. And of course, she's a very divisive figure. A lot of people love her and a lot of people don't like her. And so whenever she does something, it's off to the races in the media. And so she just got hammered for these letters that they wrote, saying that she was the new McCarthy, and that she was going after innocent Muslims. But if you read the letters that she and the other 4 members of Congress put together, it was all very well documented, and it all relied upon the Muslim Brotherhood's own documents, statements by government officials, stuff that the US government has said. But the problem is that as soon as this gets into the realm of political theater and media, nothing gets a fair shake. It becomes all about the personality and the theater of it. And so since A lot of people didn't like Michelle Bachmann. They were all screaming at her, and then you had a lot of people that do like her screaming back. And the crux of the matter just wasn't really addressed, even though everything in those letters was very well documented and provable.
Yes, sir.
Is Chris Christie's...
The implication
Oh,
of
sorry.
what you're saying
You're next.
is that we can somehow or other differentiate when there is credible information and when it's just a Donnybrook between people that want to create a hullabaloo. How is it that we are supposed to be able to discern which it is? Whether it's credible or whether it's just people shouting.
You mean information in general, or you mean when there's like a political theater?
Where's the credible source?
Gotcha. Look at the core documents. I guarantee you, probably 99.9% of even reporters that covered the story when that happened, when those letters went out, didn't actually read the documents, didn't read the letters themselves. Everyone focused on the fact that someone, some divisive political figure, claimed that there were Muslim Brotherhood tied individuals in the government, which sounds crazy, I get it. But no one looked at, when I was writing about this, it was hard for even me to find those core documents, because no one was paying attention to them. That should have been where everyone was drawing their information. So as consumers of information, when you hear a story like that, you hear about a letter or you hear about anything involving a core document, that should be public, and that's what you need to look for. Because with the way the media is now, in the 30-second news culture, and where everything is about conflict, and it's like a sports game, you're getting poor treatment.
Is Chris Christie still involved with that imam that is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood?
As far as we know, yes. What he's referring to is, and this pains me to say it because just on a personality level, I like the governor. It's just I like F. Frank's style. So I don't get enjoyment out of this. But when it comes to this issue of the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islamic networks in the United States, Governor Christie is probably one of the worst officials. And it goes back to a man named Imam Kantanani, who's a very radical imam in Patterson. He runs the Islamic Center of Passaic County. And the Department of Homeland Security is trying to kick him out of the country because he was actually convicted by the Israelis of being a Hamas member, and he lied about it on his green card, and there's all these other connections to this individual. Very solid case, otherwise the Department of Homeland Security wouldn't be going for it. But he's also a very likable guy. And he's also very well connected politically. And so when the Department of Homeland Security started trying to kick him out, he rolled in his political friends, such as Chris Christie, who was preparing to run for governor at that point, to defend him. And it worked very well, and the case is still ongoing, but it became worse after Chris Christie became the governor, where Kantanani now actually sits on a Muslim outreach committee that the governor put together. Another individual who sits on the Muslim Outreach Committee, which the names, by the way, weren't publicly disclosed. I only found it out because I did a Freedom of Information Act request on it. Another person on the Muslim Outreach Committee of this state, I went to his mosque's website and talks about beating women. When it's okay to beat women and within what parameters, and just sheer anti-American and pro-jihad rhetoric with no gray area, no way to explain it. And yet somehow he gets on a government commission. And then one other thing I would mention about Kantanani and the Christie relationship. There was an individual named Sohail Muhammad that was appointed as a Superior Court judge. And there was a lot of controversy over that because he's a Muslim. I don't care if you appoint a Muslim to a position at all. But the question was, how did Christie know Sohail Muhammad? It was Kantanani's lawyer. And so you see time and time again, this guy Kantanani, who the Department of Homeland Security wants to kick out, being tied to the administration, and when you bring it up to Christie, he says, nope, I know better, he's a good guy, and he actually was recorded over the summer saying that the critics of Kantanani are bigots. So I guess the Department of Homeland Security is full of bigots.
All right, yes, sir.
I've been reading that Muslims could end up controlling, not so many years from now, all the countries in Western Europe. With France being the first one to become Muslim. Do you believe that?
I've heard different I've been trying to figure that out. I've seen conflicting information regarding the birth rates and what the demographic projections are like for Europe. It's definitely concerning because the growth rates are very, very massive. And the reason it's more concerning than in the Muslim American community is because if you look at the polls, the European Muslim community is a lot more radical. The Muslim American community is very moderate. Very different. And you look at what's happening in Europe, it's very frightening. For example, in France, there are hundreds of what are called sensitive urban zones. And they're dubbed no-go zones. These are poor, mostly Muslim immigrant areas where there are high levels of radicalism, where the police don't feel safe going in and exercising effective control. So the government actually maps them out as areas that kind of recommend that you don't go to. You also had Muslim Brotherhood type Islamists become the mayor of a borough of London by infiltrating the election system and possibly engaging in fraud and various other things. So if you want to have a good sense of how they're going to operate in the United States, how they operate here, and a foreshadowing of what's to come, you have to look at Europe. And what's going on in Europe right now isn't pretty.
Okay, let's take one more last question. Anybody have another question? Yes, sir, if you would.
First of all, I appreciate what you had to say tonight.
Thank you.
I've been doing a lot of reading about this, trying to keep an objective point of view. And I'm not sure you have a question. I'm going to say to you that listening to what you said tonight, and my research, it doesn't sound like it's going to end well. And I have great concern about that. I have great concern about not only what's going on in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and how it affects us. I have great concern about what's going on in Europe. I also have great concern about what's going on in this country. And the fact that we seem to be led by leaders that would rather look the other way, who are not doing what they need to do to protect this country. I'm not just talking national security, but things from within. And so what I would say is we got to pay attention, and we have to make sure that what we do is get people in office who are going to protect what we hold dear. And I have great, not going to affect me because I'm too, by the time I'm gone, it's not going to happen, but my daughter, my grandkids, what about them? So maybe my question for you is, where do you see this going in the future? What do you think it's going to, what does our future look like?
There's two movements happening. There's two trends. One very positive and one very negative, and I'm not sure how that's going to match up. But the one very negative one is obviously you have the Muslim Brotherhood rising up, and at the same time you have the US and the West become desensitized to this issue because we're all about Al-Qaeda. That's our frame of reference. If you're different than Al-Qaeda, then we're not really worried about you. But then, on the other hand, there's this other trend, and we're experiencing what I think can almost be called the second phase of the Arab Spring. Now, what happened during the first phase? You had secular governments fall, and you had Muslim Brotherhood and Muslim Brotherhood types come to power. But now it looks like we're entering a second phase, where the people that elected those Muslim Brotherhood types are regretting their decision. And so you have protests in Egypt right now against the Muslim Brotherhood. And remember, the big problem we had with the Muslim Brotherhood and with this ideology is how do you undercut their popularity? You can cut off people's financing, you can cut off their arms, but if you can't cut off their popularity, what can you do? And they're doing a lot of the work for us. So in Tunisia right now, there is a big backlash against the Islamists, the Brotherhood type there. In Egypt, you have ongoing protests against the Brotherhood. In Bangladesh, a country that virtually no one pays attention to, there is a massive uprising against radical Islamic parties there that people are saying is the first popular uprising against Islamist political parties. And then in Iran, for example, the people that, the new generation, the younger folks, they hate the current regime. So what you're seeing happen is that these radical forces take power, but then the people that once supported them realize that they're not all that they cracked up to be. And where that goes from here, whether they're going to be able to garner enough power in order to overthrow them, or at least keep them in check, I don't know. But I definitely do hope on the policy level, my one major recommendation is that we need to have an outreach program to secular democratic forces around the world, especially in the Muslim world. And yes, the Muslim Brotherhood and the rest of them will cry that we're meddling and being imperialistic, but when people ask us for help, nonviolent help, and they're pursuing the same freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States, we should offer them that help.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what do you say we end on that note? Sorry to control this audience for the past hour and a half, and I do thank you for truly making a great presentation.
Thank you.
You'll be welcome back anytime. So, once again, remind everybody, please have a safe trip.